Hello, everyone. Happy Wednesday, and thanks for joining us for another exciting AdvisorShares AlphaNooner. Today, we are very excited to welcome back Loren DeFalco, who is the head of research at CB1 Capital. Excited to spend some time with him talking through the implications of cannabis, the recent executive order, CBD, and more as we kind of work through what has been a very interesting few years in the world of cannabis. Loren has some great expertise when it comes to sort of the medical side. That's where a lot of the focus has been on cannabis and cannabinoids lately. So it's a great time to kind of spend some time with him, get some more insight in terms of where things could be going, what the current policies kind of ultimately mean, and where we could go from here. One, if you're joining us, thanks as always, really appreciate it. Two, if you have any comments or questions as we go along, a good reminder that you can put them in the chat and we'll get to them as we go along. With all that said, Loren, thanks so much for spending your time with us. How is your week starting out? It's a short week.
Yes, thanks, Mackenzie, for having me. It was nice to have a nice little 3-day break, but lots of stuff going on.
Back to it. It is never boring and it is never, it's always busy, I think, ultimately. Well, so I wanted to start kind of, last time we had you on, it was in July of last year, and we were at a very different point in terms of kind of where we were in the cannabis landscape then. It was ahead of the executive order that we had gotten, but of course, it was kind of at a time that we were getting these breadcrumbs from the administration that something was going around in the world of kind of medical cannabis. Would love to kind of get a temperature check on, what has changed meaningfully from the last time you've been on.
So I think obviously the biggest thing would be the executive order on December 18th by the president. Also, some talk about within the executive order on CBD getting into the Medicare program. So a couple of big issues is a request for a move to Schedule 3, as well as putting CBD into the Medicare program. And again, easy to forget Medicare, Medicaid. Medicare is to care, aid is to aid the poor is the way to think about it. So it's Medicare.
Yeah, which I think is important. Again, I think a lot of the base of this administration is a little bit older. We talk a lot about, the different types of people and demographics that use cannabis. And I do think in that older generation, while there still may be a little bit of kind of outdated ideas around cannabis, I think these are people that really do need it and have an urgent need for pain management, sleep management, all these different things that I think things like a cannabinoid like CBD can kind of address. So I think important to kind of focus in there. And I know we'll spend some time talking about cannabinoids and CBD in specifics. But I did also just want to get your temperature check on, I think there's been a lot of conversation on following the executive order and kind of heading into this year, as we haven't really heard that much from the administration in terms of getting this actually across the finish line. A little bit of pushback, a little bit more kind of the prohibitionist talk and chatter coming back into play. Wanted to get kind of your temperature check on that front. Do you find that meaningful? Is it valid? What's sort of the thought there?
In terms of the prohibitionist pushback being meaningful?
In terms of that, like that chatter, I think kind of picking up again. I think we've seen it in the past. It kind of ebbs and flows around when we get news, I think, in terms of the cannabis space. But just curious if you think anything is different this time versus kind of what we've seen in the past.
No, you tend to think, because there's resources used when you have a coordinated effort, and I don't know what the effort would be around, as the election isn't for months away. So what is going on right now that would probably increase the use of those resources to push back? And a thought I think some people have is that the Schedule 3 announcement is soon. Excuse me. And a lot of the pushback is on legalization, not on Schedule 3. There's some that push back on Schedule 3, with the fear mongering that'll lead to legalization, which is irrelevant to the language in the Controlled Substance Act as to where a compound belongs. If somebody chooses to abuse that shouldn't mean that we disregard the CSA in terms of the language and what should fit where. So I think when you look at a lot of these arguments, they're rehashed from years and decades ago. It's really all correlative, meaning you'll hear them use language like associated with, tied to, things that don't necessarily point to a mechanism of action, which is important to understand. Well, if this data set is showing an issue, how is that issue actually happening, to understand if there's correlation versus causation. So when you look at the vast majority, and there's a lot of different things being put out there, it's all correlative. There is no data to support specifically a mechanism of action to point to cannabis being the responsible party for whatever adverse event is going on. So I think that needs to be well understood by people, that you have to actually look at the data that they're presenting. And more often than not, there is no definitive mechanism of action to point to. It's just correlated data. And everyone knows preclinical correlative data, similar thoughts. It's early. You need RCT, randomized clinical trials, to point to exactly how things are occurring versus observational, retrospective type of data that isn't necessarily showing you the direct connection. It's just showing you a connection.
That makes sense. So probably a good practice to have across the board, sort of reading beyond the headline and trying to really dig in, figuring out, like you're saying, what is actually causal versus what is kind of suggested as a connection and kind of maybe something to sell a story.
And there, and there's more to it. When you look at what they're referencing, they're saying cannabis use. And everyone who works with cannabis knows there's hundreds of compounds. There's 100 or so cannabinoids, but there's flavonoids. There's all kinds of different compounds in there. So to look at a data set that doesn't actually tell you what specifically is driving it could be any of the compounds in there, or it could be none of them. And so there's a ton of vagary that's been used by these folks pushing back. And, then there's the issues of, okay, well, let's just say that they were using the same strain of cannabis, all these people over all that time that they've been looked at. How do we know there's no pesticides? I mean, we know when you go back into the 80s and I think maybe the 70s, they would drop this pesticide, I think it was paraquat, on crops in Mexico, South America, very harmful. So, how many people that were looked at in these studies were actually exposed to pesticides that are harmful? I mean, DDT is banned for a reason. It's a pesticide. We used it, and then we realized there was problems. So, to ignore the idea that some of these issues could be coming from something else is really not good, and that's why it's a lot of it is correlative.
Yeah. Do you think some of it is still kind of the frustrating bit of cannabis getting painted with a broad brush where the illicit market, sort of the intoxicating hemp market and the legalized regulated cannabis market are all kind of getting sloshed together? And I think some of the ills maybe from those other areas are getting pointed. Um,
Sure, you have a lack of regulations. So even just the extracting of the cannabinoids from the biomass, there could be impurities in there. We don't know what people are ingesting because the hemp market, which has kind of been the Wild West, really has no regulations. So it's hard to know what cannabinoids or what impurity is driving some issues. Now, hospitalizations, emergency room visits are likely driven by misdosing, mislabeling. We know that the labels oftentimes don't match what's actually in the product. And this is why regulations are needed to avoid some of those issues.
Yeah, that makes sense. I was going to ask in terms of combating this and kind of having a better experience with cannabis, better reporting on cannabis, what is needed? Is it education and sort of from a user perspective of, where people are sourcing cannabis, what the differences are, how much, if you haven't used cannabis before, that you shouldn't be starting probably with 200 milligrams or something like that, versus just having more research writ large and kind of really understanding the compounds and the cannabinoids in general. Is it column A, column B, one more important than the other, something else?
It's definitely both. A lack of understanding. I mean, even people who I know who've used cannabis for a long time had no idea what HHC was. So there's compounds that people have no reference for, and they're using them thinking, oh, it's from the plant. And again, some of these are, but they're in very, very minuscule amounts that can only be, increased through extraction and synthesis oftentimes. And so we believe some of these compounds are minuscule for a reason. When you amplify them without longer term data sets, it's hard to know what really will occur. But yeah, that's part of the issue is there's not enough knowledge or education that is out there for people to understand this. And as we move into a Schedule 3 and we start to look at these compounds in a different way, I think that helps people to make the decisions if we can get that educational information out there.
Yeah, that's great. I think rescheduling obviously unlocks so much, but definitely from the research front, of course, that's so important. But I think even further from a normalization perspective, I know there are so many Americans that are currently cannabis users, CBD users, all of those things. And I think, while you build an education, I think you can work with bud tenders, or even you can find some good content, I think, online from good resources. I think there's still more to be done on that front. I do think also, hopefully, with the closure of the hemp loophole for intoxicating hemp, we do see some of the maybe mislabeling elements kind of get tidied up there. So hopefully we see things move in a positive direction. But I did want to spend some time digging into what you mentioned earlier with the executive order and the specific call up for CBD. I think that was kind of a surprise for people. Everyone was very focused on the rescheduling side of things. I think this is sort of a great, important bonus. Would love to spend a little bit more time just kind of talking through, where that is and then potential impact of the CBD side of things.
Sure, and this is a follow-up, I think, from the video that President Trump put out in regards to the endocannabinoid system, which, when you look at the pushback from the prohibitionists, they've never heard of the endocannabinoid system. They don't understand the purpose of the ECS or phytocannabinoid supplementation for perhaps a deficiency in the ECS. Dr. Ethan Russo has the clinical endocannabinoid deficiency syndrome that he's talked about and written papers about, points to the idea that at times we need to supplement with phytocannabinoids when our internal endocannabinoid system perhaps is not at the right tone or working as well as it should. So that video was put out by Donald Trump, I think in September-ish, and that led to this executive order of CBD in terms of understanding why, as we age, these compounds, specifically CBD, can be very useful for the elderly. That was the genesis, I believe, of this whole idea, and it's a huge cost saver as well for Medicare, for people that are using, polypharma, a ton of different over the counter or prescription drugs to deal with issues like sleep, pain, arthritic pain, stuff like that, that can be handled by one compound or one substance, cannabis.
Yeah, no, I think that's super important. And I think in general, this is supposed to go into effect in early spring. Is that right? I think nothing has derailed that, but I feel like there hasn't been much coverage recently yet.
Yeah, April 1st is supposed to be the date. I know, I think it was one of the Stanley brothers of the famous, Charlotte Figge, when Dr. Sanjay Gupta had him on years ago, was speaking the other day on a podcast, and he had said that the rules were kind of put into effect a couple weeks ago. We're just waiting for the launch of that pilot program. And the pilot program should work for, folks that have cancer, pain issues, palliative care for cancer as a starting point. And it should expand beyond that into other indications as the pilot hopefully proves successful.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. Can you talk a little bit more about CBD and some of the cannabinoids that are also on that non-psychoactive side of things? I think for most people, they're probably very familiar with CBD. It's one that I think almost not predated cannabis, but I think was easier to access for a longer period. I think was just more kind of aware for people who are dealing with pain and medical kind of sides of things. But I know there's so much more in the cannabinoid stuff, and I know you are deeply involved in understanding sort of that medical side. What can you kind of tell us about the other cannabinoids that are non-psychoactive?
Sure. So there's about 100 and maybe close to 20 different cannabinoids that they've discovered, and we know a good or a decent amount on maybe five of them. That's pretty much where we are. So there's a ton of work that needs to be done. We're involved with a company, a private company that is using some of these minor cannabinoids, CBC and CBG specifically for anti-infective purposes, basically killing all harmful bacteria, killing fungus, biofilms, a whole host of different issues. That is, the data is pretty unique, unprecedented in terms of its effect across broad spectrum bacteria and fungus.
Mhm,
So that's data that we've been exposed to that is very encouraging for some of these minor cannabinoids, as they call them.
mhm,
There's also different work being done on pain indications, different mental health indications, a whole host of different things, but most of this is still in the preclinical phase. So Some is moving into the clinic now. We have some limited clinical data. But again, most of the medical community isn't going to really start pointing to this until there's a FDA approval, a positive phase three FDA approval, which is then considered, good.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. And none of this fits in sort of the fast tracking programs that the FDA has come through. Because it seems like being able to create antifungal protections and things like that seems important, seems very relevant for a ton of Americans. And it seems like there's nothing currently in place that works as well from what I've heard in terms
Right.
of, so is it possible to?
They're eligible for fast track
Oh,
designation.
there it is.
Yeah, it depends on the indication, depends on, what's available for treatment. Oftentimes, if there's not, you'll be eligible for other types of ways to move it forward faster. There's also getting in clinical trials through a shorter 505(b)(2) pathway that if it's a repurposed drug like dronabinol, which is THC essentially, you can use that to go through and start in phase two versus doing all the preclinical work to go into phase one. So there's a lot of work being done, not just in the US, but again, most of it is in the EU, Israel, Australia. There's a lot of work being done around the world. But the US is hopefully going to start catching up soon.
That's good. I was going to say, is that just because of the global interest ultimately, or just the easier regulatory frameworks versus the US?
Easier regulatory frameworks.
Yeah, that's true. Which again, hopefully changes here in the US because it is tough to have fallen behind. I think different areas, especially I think Canada on the recreational side, but also of course with all this medical research, I think wanting to be more of a pioneer rather than playing catch up, I think is a great spot to be.
Well, Israel was, Meshulam, Dr. Meshulam was, one of the godfathers of cannabis. He had discovered stuff way early on, other folks as well. So, a lot of the research out of Techion, out of Israel has really done a lot. Spain and Italy as well. There's been a lot of work out of those countries as well. So it's grown. Australia's ramping up. They have that Lambert initiative down there. Canada has a good amount of work going on as well. And we just see this moving forward.
Yeah, really interesting. In terms of the breakdown, is there any insight in terms of what is attracting more research and attention in dollars for psychoactive versus non-psychoactive cannabinoids?
I'm sorry, is there more capital going to non-euphoric?
Yeah.
I don't know if there's a central database that would have that answer. I tend to think there's more interest in the non-euphoric cannabinoids for adverse event issues. One of the groups that we're working with has a transdermal, breast cancer for pain formulation, and it's applied topically. So you don't have the issue of systemic, effect, which would really cause that euphoria, that high. And so if we can avoid those types of issues, I think it has a much better chance of getting through the FDA as well as uptake post FDA approval.
Interesting. In terms of also patients, I feel like, is there more acceptance from non-psychoactive? I think kind of separating it from maybe past stigmas from cannabis. Is there any sort of breakdown there, do you think?
I don't know if there's a breakdown, but anything that alters your mental state is less desirable, I would think. So any, and this gets into where you have THC, you have THCA, these acidic cannabinoids, and the acidic cannabinoids tend to not have any euphoric impact, and you can give it much higher levels. The issue with these compounds is stability. And now there's been some patents issued of late, companies that have perfected what they think is stability for these compounds. So I think, in short order, and short being the next few years, we should start to see more folks using those acidic cannabinoids for therapeutic potential, possibly getting higher payloads needed without that euphoria that you typically get from the non-acidic cannabinoids.
That makes sense. It is kind of funny to think of not wanting a euphoric effect because that sounds very positive. But yeah, I guess ultimately, you don't necessarily need that for certain treatments. And I think you're right. It could add potentially complications, although I know many people do enjoy sort of cannabis just for the euphoric effects ultimately. So there's a wide
And
range.
the euphoric effects are great at a lower level, or if you've gotten tolerant, you need much higher doses. And you're not going to get the same euphoric effect as if you didn't have the tolerance. So each individual situation is going to be different, of course.
Yeah, that makes sense. And again, I'm imagining that is going to be continue to be refined and tailored based on the research that hopefully is able to kind of come through. That makes sense. All right. Well, then in terms of kind of the market and the investment lens of it all, I think in the past you've talked about how kind of the market has not priced in sort of the real medical efficacy of these cannabinoids and all of that. Has that changed over time? Do you think, because this has taken a good amount of time to actually come into effect and get done, that the kind of market expectations have caught up? What's your sort of gauge on that front?
I don't think they've caught up yet. I think, most people, investors who look at cannabinoid drug development, A, don't really understand it. B, they look at Epidiolex and they say, oh, well, it works for seizures. And C, natural compounds are at a disadvantage for drug development from an investor's point of view because you're talking about a 20-year patent on a new chemical entity, an analog, versus the organic compound where you're probably going to, at best, get a 7-year exclusivity through orphan status. So, we one of the companies I mentioned before was successful and developing a patent for 3 compounds, 2 of them organic cannabinoids, and it looks fantastic. But that's a combination that they're getting the patent on versus if you just take an organic compound, you can't have a patent on the compound. You can have a patent on the indication for the compound, but again, there's possible issues there as well. So that is, we think the biggest hurdle from an investor's point of view is most biotech investors are looking for that 20-year patent.
Yeah, that makes sense. Out of curiosity, I think we've talked with a lot of people about sort of the recreational cannabis leaders and kind of their expectations around rescheduling, when it gets done, not when, but how quickly it could get done potentially. From talking sort of more on the medical side, is there a temperature check in terms of how these kind of operators are thinking about the landscape changing? Is there any waiver in confidence? What's sort of if you can share?
I don't know if they're paying too much attention, those involved in the work right now. There's probably a whole bunch of folks that have an idea to take a compound for an indication, and start the preclinical work. But until there's, this opening, which we think comes from Schedule 3, the recognition of the medical value, that there's not really a large appetite from investors. Now, we think that changes once Schedule 3 comes in and more of this data starts to come out that we've been talking about here. But yeah, it's just there needs to be more exposure, needs to be more understanding of the opportunities.
Yeah, that makes sense. I feel like it's been an industry that's been waiting to be unlocked for so long. And I think when that comes, that will be very exciting, obviously. In terms of, change from when we do see hopefully that rescheduling, hopefully soon,
Mhm.
what's your expectation in terms of how quickly we get that re-rating in terms of, seeing this from investors as something that they want to take a look at?
Well, for sure, I think the adult use or state medical programs probably quicker. I think you're going to have folks that look at it from the biotech therapeutic side that they're going to spend time doing the research, maybe not investing as quickly because it's just a much more involved process, I'll say.
Mhm.
So, yeah, it's hard to know how quickly. But I think if you get some good clinical data out of one of these companies that are going through the clinic, that will spur investor interest a little bit more quickly, perhaps.
That's
We
fair.
need to get some more positive data outside of epilepsy, and I think that starts to open up people's minds.
That's fair. I'm sure also in addition to investors, I would imagine that kind of opens up acquisition opportunities as well, which I'm sure is front and center. True.
Sure. I expect post scheduling that we will have a whole bunch of M&A. Um, yeah, I mean, we've seen a little bit on the private side, a little bit of late. But yeah, we should see some consolidation, some roll-ups start to occur.
Yep. Reading on that, I think unlock ultimately. So I guess just kind of taking it full circle. So when we talked back in July, I feel like we were in a spot where there were some kind of breadcrumbs that we were getting from the administration, but it was relatively quiet. And then right at the end of the finish line, we did get that executive order as was anticipated. Out of curiosity, I know we are still waiting for that finalization, but I feel like we're finding ourselves in kind of a rhyming situation, a history rhyming situation where it's kind of the same spot. We have this, momentum and this kind of thing teed up and ready to go, but not hearing a ton from the administration currently in terms of getting it actually through and done. Do you view this as kind of a parallel to the last year and think that it does kind of just follow soon? What's your thought? I know, again, I'm not pushing you to a date, of course, but what are your thoughts?
Yeah, feels like Groundhog Day.
Mhm.
I would expect, that in the coming days, weeks, we hear something. I don't think this pushes back to the back half of the year. Doesn't mean it can't, no, but it would just seem that they highlighted this as one of their 3 or 4 accomplishments, the White House for 2025. This was 2 weeks ago, I think. So it's hard to see them pointing to 3 or 4 issues as their highlights for the year, and this is gonna be left by the wayside. Anything can happen, but it just doesn't seem logical. Not that
Mhm.
too many things our industry do, but that's 2.5 weeks ago that they touted this. So
Yeah,
yeah, I think it's moving forward.
that's true. And I guess does midterms must change, I guess the calculus and the pressure to get that done, I would hope.
Yes, the midterms are going to be interesting. I think this is part of the effort to appeal to folks on the fence, maybe some younger people. It's a very simple reclassification. This is not legalization. It's a simple reclassification, but it shows progress for the first time in outside of the states in 80 years or 90 years, 100
Mhm.
years. It's
Yeah,
been
yeah.
a while.
True. Yeah. No, I think, again, being able to pull the popularity from across demographics, but I do genuinely think, of course, younger people are using cannabis much more in the US than they're, using alcohol or kind of previously used, I guess, recreational or medical things. But I do think the older population and maintaining that sort of boomer population and the popularity for medical use for aches and pains, arthritis, like you're saying, sleep, I think is sort of the sleeper push. So we'll have to see, but ultimately eagerly anticipating that coming through and very much looking forward to touching base with you on the other side to kind of see how the research opens up and kind of what the next, steps could be for the world of cannabis, which is very exciting.
Yes.
All right. Well, then kind of wrapping things up, I just wanted to touch base on you've been in the space for a long time. It is obviously very important to you. It has a personal level to you. Would love to know kind of, what's keeping you motivated in pushing this forward. It is important, but would love to hear kind of, what's keeping you excited.
And the motivation is really the idea that there's better answers out there for people that are suffering. I mean, I personally suffered under many different indications, and the answers I was given never worked. They were all pretty horrible for me, and it was not fun, to say the least. So the motivation is that people who are suffering can find a better solution, and it's a real problem. And the prohibitionists don't understand or are willfully ignorant to the thousands, millions of people that are getting relief from something far safer than some of these pharmaceutical drugs or over the counter. And those things still have their place. But pain, sleep, there's a whole bunch of indications that we believe are much better treated with natural cannabinoids versus some of these other pharmaceuticals, and people tend to suffer. And so, yes, that's the motivation.
I think that makes sense. Reducing suffering is a very noble and reasonable thing to push forward, especially having your own personal history kind of backing it up. But for a lot of people out there, I think you don't have to be personally suffering with some of the things that cannabinoids can help treat to understand that ultimately it opens up better tools for other people. And I think that makes a big difference. All right. Well, again, Loren, thanks so much for taking the time. Really appreciate it. very excited to spend some time on the other side of rescheduling, and also the CBD program will be very interesting to hear.
Thanks, Mackenzie.
much.
Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the day.
Talk soon. Thanks.
Before investing, carefully consider the investment objectives, risks, charges, and expenses found in the prospectus, available at AdvisorShares.com.